This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. Today, we're taking a fresh look at one of the most studied figures in American history. For generations, we've known Abraham Lincoln as the great emancipator, the savior of the Union, and one of America's greatest presidents. But what if one of his greatest strengths wasn't just his eloquence or moral conviction, but his political skill? Our guest today argues that Lincoln was a master strategist and coalition builder whose understanding of party politics helped save the Union and secure emancipation. In his new book, Boss Lincoln, The Partisan Life of Abraham Lincoln, it's been called a landmark book, Team of Rivals on Steroids, by historian Harold Holster in the Wall Street Journal. And joining us is one of America's foremost Lincoln scholars, the Pohanka Chair in American Civil War History and director of the House Divided Project at Dickinson College, Matthew Pinsker. Welcome to the Speaking of Writers podcast.
Thanks, Steve. It's good to be with you.
Great to have you here. So, Matthew, the title itself is just fascinating. Why Boss Lincoln? What did you want readers to understand immediately about this side of Lincoln?
I think everybody knows Lincoln was a political figure, that he was good at politics. But my argument is that he wasn't just a typical politician, not just trying to win office. His main ambition in politics was to build parties. He built and led three different parties in his life. And I think it's the defining element of his success. It's what separated him from a lot of other, peers. And it's something we can still learn from today.
Lincoln has been portrayed as everything from a saint to a reluctant politician. What made you think we've been overlooking the political operator hiding in plain sight?
Right. Not just the political operator, but the partisan operator. So the main texts of this book are kind of Lincoln's private and confidential notes. We think of politics as a series of campaigns and elections with speeches and debates, and every Lincoln biographer covers his great speeches, and they're worthy of coverage, but it's only half the story. And what this book really does is look behind the scenes, off the podium, and it examines how Lincoln led and organized his peers and subordinates. He couldn't use the phone. He didn't have, Twitter, but he used a lot of notes and letters, and he was secretive, and he coded them with a kind of classification system, and that's the main body of material that makes this book different. His private letters, his confidential letters, his private and confidential letters. He wrote some letters where he would mark them for your eye only, and then a handful of letters where he wrote "burn this" on them. Now, Steve, you don't have to be a PhD to know that if you're reading a letter that says "burn this," the guy didn't burn it, and it's gold. And that's why I feel confident saying, look, I'm not calling him Boss Lincoln because he was dirty. He's not like Boss Tweed. He wasn't hiding corruption. He was trying to keep people focused. He was avoiding leaks to the press. He was disciplined and commanding. And that's why I think he deserves the moniker Boss Lincoln.
I want to touch on those letters for a moment. Was there one or two letters or a discovery there that made you say, we've misunderstood this man?
So there are dozens of important ones. One of the ones that's most striking, I don't know if it means we misunderstood him, but one of the ones that's most striking is a recently discovered note that he wrote to the editor of the Chicago Tribune, a guy named Charles Ray, in 1858. And it's only been available to scholars since 2008. So like when Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote Team of Rivals, she didn't have access to this letter.
No.
And it's the angriest letter Lincoln ever wrote that we know about. Okay. He's furious over some kind of messaging misstep that they made at the Chicago Tribune. So, the press was different than it is today. It wasn't fair and balanced. Okay. The newspapers back then worked for the parties and they were open about it. They didn't hide behind objectivity. And so when Lincoln writes a letter to the editor of the Chicago Tribune, when he's a candidate for the U.S. Senate as the Republican Party nominee, he's dressing down a subordinate. He's not, writing a public letter to the editor. And this letter to Ray, the one that was kept hidden until recently, it's just 7 sentences, one sarcastic question after another. The opening is, how can you let such paragraphs into the Tribune as the enclosed cut from yesterday? The second sentence is, did Sheehan write them? James Sheehan was the editor of the Democratic newspaper in Chicago. This is Lincoln furious. And he goes on and he starts, insulting other men involved in their party, makes fun of Horace Greeley, the famous editor, and he slanders somebody named Sister Burlingame. Now, he's not talking about a Catholic nun. He's talking about Anson Burlingame, a Republican congressman from Massachusetts. Now, this is not Lincoln. I mean, this is not how Lincoln sounds in most of his writings. It's obviously kind of out of step for his character, but it's clearly part of his character. I mean, we shouldn't be shocked. He's human. He lost his temper sometimes, but we don't think of him that way. And I think we just need a more well-rounded, more realistic understanding of how he operated when he wasn't at the podium speaking to crowds.
Matthew, he started as a Whig before helping build the Republican Party. What lessons did those early political battles teach him?
So look, the Whig Party was kind of a minority party all the way through Lincoln's experience with them. They elected two presidents, but especially in the state of Illinois, where he grew up to adulthood as a politician, they were always fighting uphill. And so these were hard lessons in defeat and frustration that he was learning. He was always trying as a young Whig to expand the base of the party. Sometimes people misremember him as a Henry Clay Whig, like it was some kind of cult of personality that he admired the Whig Party founder and did whatever he could to live up to his standard. But Lincoln was far more pragmatic than that. And the first third of the book talks about how he was what they would call a Whig fusionist, somebody who was trying to build and grow the Whig Party. And at times that meant that he threw Henry Clay overboard. And he had no qualms about doing that because he was such a devoted partisan strategist.
The book shows Lincoln could be charming, persuasive, and occasionally intimidating too. Did researching him make you appreciate his toughness more?
It did. I was thoroughly impressed by how honest he was, even though he was tough. So he was fundamentally a man of integrity, and even when he's hiding things, he's not hiding that dirt, like I said. But what struck me was he was honest, Abe, but he was never candid, Abe. There was a lot of deception, small scale, but still revealing. He could compartmentalize, is what we would say. And not everybody around him knew what he was doing. He was kind of a loner as a decision maker. Now, that's not how we think of him. He was definitely open and friendly, and he sought information from everybody. But he didn't rely on a kitchen cabinet. He didn't have a lot of close, intimate advisors. He processed and deliberated largely on his own after widely gathering information from a network of friends and associates.
One of the big things I was surprised by, and one of the big surprises, is Lincoln's obsession with elections and vote counting, too. Were you surprised by just how hands-on he was?
You can't get around the fact that he was like a data guy. I mean, he was all about the numbers. So I told you I spend a lot of time with those private and confidential notes,
Yeah.
but just as much, I'm looking at charts that he drew up, outlining election returns, looking at the composition of legislatures, right from the beginning to the end of his career. He liked to prepare charts and data and look at the numbers and crunch the numbers. And it was it shouldn't again, it shouldn't be surprising. He's a career politician. But nonetheless, because it's Lincoln, it kind of startles you.
You argue that the Gettysburg Address carried a partisan political message. That's a fascinating interpretation there. Can you unpack that a bit here?
It's really very simple. We remember the Gettysburg Address as like a call to reunify the country. But from our perspective, that's what matters. From his perspective, it was a call to unify the North. They're in the middle of the war. They're at the end of one election cycle and at the beginning of the other. The North is divided. The whole purpose of Lincoln's leadership as a president is to try to build a coalition that can hold that Union political movement together. That's why I believe he thought his theory of the war was that you had to build a Union party to save the Union. and it was just as important as the Union Army and the Union Navy winning battles on land and at sea. And so when Lincoln goes to Gettysburg in November 1863, he is right at that moment when the Union movement is fracturing in different ways. And the 10-sentence Gettysburg Address is kind of perfectly crafted to appeal to both radicals and conservatives. It's almost coded. If you look at each sentence, you can
Yeah.
find allusions and references to different groups. And we could go through that if you want. It's fascinating, but it's not well known. And I don't think most of your listeners would even be aware of it if I didn't point it out to them.
Yeah. Your discussion of Lincoln's meeting with Frederick Douglass adds another layer to an already historic relationship. What should people understand about that encounter?
So first, Douglas was just as tough as Lincoln.
Hmm.
These are like two political bosses. Of course, Douglas can't, run for office and win office easily. He is a voter in New York. I mean, black men could vote in 5 states during the Civil War. Douglas qualified in New York as a voter. But he was mostly an orator and a newspaper editor. And he had Lincoln sparred in 3 different meetings during the Civil War. They were allies, but there was friction because Douglas is pushing Lincoln on different policies. At the end of the war, Lincoln's pushing Douglas, though. It's one of the most revealing meetings. Late summer 1864, Lincoln's the Union Party nominee for president, but Douglas hasn't endorsed him yet. And Lincoln is trying to, put pressure on the remaining abolitionists and, wayward radicals who haven't come around to support the ticket. And so he brings Douglas into the White House and sort of indicates to him that he's thinking about lowering the terms for peace talks that might include walking back emancipation. Douglas tells him, don't do it. It would be a terrible mistake. And then Lincoln reminds him that he's in trouble politically. He might lose. And if he does lose, then, all of the work they've done toward emancipation and abolition is going to be for naught. And so he's going to need Douglas to be prepared in case of defeat to go to the ground as a kind of new Underground Railroad operative and help bring out as many slaves as he could. Now, historians have interpreted this in different ways, and my book offers a kind of fresh way to think about it. But I make the case that what Lincoln is really trying to do is send a very intimidating message to Douglas, which is get on board or else everything you fought for is going to be at risk. And Douglas certainly got on board. He sends Lincoln a letter a couple of weeks later outlining this plan for an emergency Underground Railroad. But then he asks Lincoln for a favor. And he says his son is sick and they won't discharge him from the army, and he asks for help. Lincoln immediately sends the letter to the War Department, orders the furloughing of Douglas's son. And then a few weeks later, Douglas endorses him. And, it's part of a sort of series of trades between these two party bosses to try to get everybody on the same page. I find it fascinating.
Yeah. Let's stay in 1864 for a moment, in the election of 1864. It may have been Lincoln's greatest political challenge. How close did he come to losing?
Well, they don't have polls back then,
Hmm.
but everybody thought he was going to lose. Now, I don't think he did. Lincoln was pretty determined. He had, a strategy that made sense. But everybody around him was panicking. Summer of 64, when he's meeting with Douglas, it's the same moment when he's getting all kinds of pressure. And I don't know if everybody has heard about this, but it's pretty well known. He wrote down a secret memo. They call it the Blind Memorandum on August 23rd, 1864, where he says, this morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be reelected. And then he outlines a plan to work with the president-elect between the November election and the March inauguration to try to save the Union. And he folds it up and then has his cabinet members sign it without reading it. That's why people have called it the Blind Memorandum. But some people misinterpreted, in my opinion. I don't think he was trying to get the members of the cabinet to, pledge their loyalty to this proposal. They didn't know what it was. None of them even wrote about it in their letters or diaries. What he was trying to do is get them to date stamp the document, and he was preparing this as an emergency plan B just in case he lost. Now, I don't think he actually thought he was going to lose, but he was smart enough as a political leader to know that it was possible. And what he wanted to prepare for was to send a message to the guy who beat him that if I did lose, I've known for weeks I was going to lose, and I'm willing to turn over the keys to the White House to you. But let's work together from November to March to try to finish the war so that you won't inherit this messy, unfinished war and you could just be the peace president. And it's kind of a stunning, remarkable thing. Basically, my whole book is kind of an argument for why that interpretation of the memo makes the most sense, because it's kind of the way Lincoln was, very cagey, very isolated, very independent, and very tough-minded.
Matthew, what impressed you most about Lincoln's political instincts under pressure?
Okay. In a way, that's a great question because I think it's the reason why we admire Lincoln most. Under the worst pressure, he kept his principles. So he's tough-minded and he's, commanding and he can be really strategic. But his North Star was his North Star. So you ask me, what was his North Star? It was democracy. So at the moment when he's under the most pressure, when his aides and advisors are warning him he's going to lose the election in the middle of a civil war, he decides he's not going to cancel the election. Now, there were plenty of people who would have supported that. But he said afterwards, we cannot have free government without elections. And I think that kind of faith in government of the people, by the people, for the people, that's what we need in our leaders. We need the ones who have principles like Lincoln, but also the strategic toughness that Lincoln embodied. That's a rare combination of qualities.
How'd you become a writer?
Well, I have always been interested in history. I worked as a research assistant to a great Lincoln biographer named David Donald when I was in college. And then I went into academics. I've been teaching and writing about Lincoln and the Civil War and the Underground Railroad ever since. It's hard work. The book took me a long time, but I've really enjoyed, the career.
If Lincoln could read this book today, what argument do you think he'd agree with, and what would he probably challenge?
Oh, that's so tough. It's unfair to ask you that question. I will tell you a funny story though in response. So I'm kind of one of those revisionist historians. I challenge a lot of orthodox interpretations. And several years back, I'm doing this at an event in Gettysburg, and it's on C-SPAN. And whenever you speak at Gettysburg, you'll get Lincoln reenactors who show up. So there I am pitching my revisionism in Gettysburg on C-SPAN, and the cameras pan to a row of Lincolns. And as I'm talking, the Lincolns are shaking their head. Mm-mm. Like that can't be right. And I remember thinking to myself, it's almost like Lincoln himself says, no, you got this wrong. So I hope I got it all right. I'm sure I got some of it wrong, but I have no idea what he would find good or bad about this interpretation.
All right, this is going to be part of our America 250 series here on the Speaking of Writers podcast. So, as America approaches the 250th anniversary of its founding, what do you think Lincoln would want Americans to remember about democracy and civic responsibility?
It's really very simple. The key to democracy is recognizing that it's not the Greek word for perfect. That in our 250-year history of the Republic, we've had lots of problems, challenges, occasional violence. But if you want the Republic to endure, you have to recognize that democracy is kind of like the Greek word for disagreement. The people are not one thing. They argue with each other. And as long as we can find ways to do it with ballots and not bullets, we'll be okay. The worst we ever faced was when Lincoln lived during the Civil War era. Now, things feel bad now, and there's a lot of political violence and there's a lot of friction. But if we want another 250 years for this republic, we're going to have to remember the creed, learn the lessons from the Civil War, and just believe in democracy. When you lose an argument, don't quit. Just go back to the drawing board and persuade people to come around to your position. It's the only way we can all live together.
Great advice. What is next for you in your writing?
Well, I've been doing a Substack called What Would Lincoln Do? And it's a kind of series of short posts about politics in the headlines and also something I'm calling Profiles in Democracy. Um, Short pieces about the people who supported Lincoln, who made his, career possible. Like a 104-year-old man named John Phillips, who voted for Washington and also voted for Lincoln in 1864. It's an incredible story.
Wow.
And I'm thinking my next book might be Profiles in Democracy, the story of some of these unheralded but important figures.
Well, the book out now is Boss Lincoln, The Partisan Life of Abraham Lincoln, offering readers a compelling new perspective on one of history's most familiar figures by revealing the brilliant political strategist behind the legend. Our guest has been historian and author Matthew Pinsker. Matthew, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Steve.
And thank you for listening and for watching to the Speaking of Writers podcast, this part of the America 250 series. And don't forget to subscribe to the Speaking of Writers podcast on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Steve Richards. Thanks for watching and for listening. I will talk to you again next time.